Hi, folks. This week in our reading, we looked at the emergence of ecology as this discipline that went through the appearance of different schools of thought, with those groups of ecologists interacting with each other, often disagreeing, and ultimately arriving at the last in that series of ecological schools, which embraced what's termed chaos theory, which brought into question many of the assumptions that earlier practitioners of ecology had advanced prior to that point. So we're talking about roughly the 1980s or so. Going back to the 19th century, you had a number of major questions that ecologists were asking, including sort of the fundamental one of whether people exist as part of nature or whether people stand apart from the natural environment. And ecologists disagreed or had different takes on that particular point. Then you also get into the question of ecological models. And earlier in time, I think it was much more commonly believed that that nature reached through a series of stages. If there was a disruption, you would have so-called succession, in which plants and animals would recolonize an area, and ultimately it would reach its optimal or its perfected state. And so this idea that nature is governed by predictable rules and repeatable models, and that every given region or location then sort of has its perfect natural state. And of course, more recently, we're learning that that may not be entirely true. Chaos theory, which isn't really as dramatic as maybe the term sounds for ecology purposes, indicates that you have a lot of random events. Those can be natural disasters as well as human interventions that can disrupt the given stabilized state of the environment. And what happens next, though, is not necessarily predictable. In other words, the end result of that region sort of going through a process of recovery may result in something different than what you had before. We know now that the natural environment, I think more than in the past, has changed dramatically over time, that climates have changed, that that regions today oftentimes look very different than they did in the past. In the distant past, that could be much more dramatic. So an easy example would be the region that I live in, the Central Plains, which at the time of Euro-American settlement in the 1850s was mostly covered by tall grass prairie, and the trees here were confined mostly to streams and the banks of rivers. And so Laura Ingalls Wilder, in her Little House on the Prairie, describes this region back in the 1870s when her family lived here. That's not what the Central Plains look like today. There has been, over the past 150 years, the colonization of tree species and shrubs and other plants. And in the early 20th century, environmentalists looking at the Central and Southern Plains concluded that the region had degraded, that it was no longer in its natural state, and that interventions needed to be taken to return it to what was presumed to be its optimal state. However, ecologists and environmental scientists will tell you that the Southern Plains, if we went back to the end of the last ice age, would have been dramatically different than when Laura Ingalls Wilder and her family settled here. That this area was just south of the continental Laurentide Glacier that covered much of North America. This area was covered by trees that resemble the modern, mostly coniferous species that live up, near to the poles, up in like northern Canada or Alaska. And And the animals that lived here were dramatically different than the ones that are here today. And so, what does that mean basically for this idea of human beings managing nature if there is no predetermined natural state for things? And I think now there's a growing understanding that there's a combination of human intervention and natural intervention, but that things are not set in stone. That there's no absolutes really. That a lot of what I think humanity is going to do is going to reflect our own preferences, probably the needs of people. But we can't fool ourselves that we're following a blueprint or a map provided by Mother Nature, because there may not be one exactly. So I hope you've had a good week. I'm looking forward to reading your papers, which folks are putting together this week. And before you know it, we're going to be done with the term, and then we'll all be moving on to different things. So have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you later.